She was laughing at something he said. Kale didn't move, didn't speak, just stood in the doorway of the crawler's forward cabin and watched Lena lean toward the consortium officer's holographic projection, leaning into it the way she used to lean toward him in the before time, when the world still had a before time. The officer's name was Veth Haron. Kale had memorized the face from the enemy's broadcast frequencies. Angular, six-limbed, that particular shade of bioluminescent blue the consortium used for their administrative caste. And Lena was laughing. The sound was wrong. It was her laugh, her exact laugh, same pitch, same slight catch at the end, but it came from somewhere she wasn't anymore. Like a recording, like an echo of a person playing the part of itself. He closed the door quietly and went aft to find Kea. She was in the engine bay, cross-legged on an upturned fuel drum, doing what she always did when she couldn't sleep, taking apart a detonator and reassembling it in the dark. Her fingers moved like she was playing piano, each component clicking into place by memory alone. She'd been doing it since the crown came off, since Kale had cut it from her skull in the mid-bay on Relay Station 9, while Lena held the antiseptic and Sergeant Dren held Kea down and Kea screamed like something being born. The crown left marks, not just the scars at her temples, twin silver channels where the device had sat, already beginning to granulate and fade. The way she moved now had a quality to it, careful, deliberate, like she was always checking to make sure she was still the one deciding to move, that the choice was coming from inside rather than being delivered from outside. She had always had that look, Kale suspected. Some people come out of the worst things still recognizably themselves. She was one of those people. It was either very admirable or very costly, and probably it was both. "She do it again," Kea said without looking up. She was talking to Veth Haron. The detonator clicked together. Kea set it down on her knee and finally looked at him. Her eyes were dark and level, and they held the kind of patience that only comes from having had everything stripped from you, and finding out there's still something left underneath. Still some irreducible thing that couldn't be dissolved or overwritten, no matter how hard the mechanism tried. "Kale, I know. The crown didn't come all the way off her. I know that too. So what are you going to do about it?" He didn't answer right away. He sat down on the floor of the engine bay with his back against the crawler's hull, listening to the engines, 4 of them, alien-built, running on compressed thermal plasma, the kind of sound that wasn't so much heard as felt in your back teeth and your sternum simultaneously. They'd taken the crawler 6 days ago from Admiral Borland Hess's forward camp on the Kessler Flats. It had seemed, at the time, like the kind of insane decision that either wins wars or ends careers. Kale was no longer sure which category he was in. The crawler, which the consortium called something with 14 syllables, and which his crew had been calling the box since approximately the 2nd hour of occupation, could hit 90 kilometers per hour across open terrain and carry a full platoon with heavy kit. It had 4 gun ports, a signal jammer, a medical bay with functional but alien equipment, enough rations for 3 weeks if you didn't mind rations that had been manufactured with six-limbed biology in mind, and one significant design problem. The controls were built for six-limbed operators, and most of the panels were at the wrong height and angle for human hands. So Dren had spent the first day improvising an interface, and the second day repairing what he'd built during the first day. It was still faster and better armed than anything they'd had before. "Dren thinks we can reach the threshold in 4 days, Kale said. Dren's nav math is optimistic. It usually is. Usually it's optimistic by about 20%. In normal conditions. She turned the reassembled detonator over in her fingers, not activating it, just feeling the weight of it. These aren't normal conditions. No. And then what? We walk the shard into the Temple of Zeros, the Standing Stones, wherever it needs to go, and we hand it to whoever or whatever needs to receive it, and the whole crown network goes dark and everything goes back to normal. She said it without sarcasm. That was the thing about Kea, she didn't do sarcasm. She asked hard questions in a flat voice and waited for actual answers, and if you gave her half an answer she waited for the rest. It was, in its way, one of the more demanding conversational habits Kale had encountered in a life that had exposed him to many demanding conversational habits. The Shard shuts down every crown in the consortium's network, Kale said. That's what Gajan said. That's what Gajan died saying. He heard his own voice go flat on the last word and didn't correct it. Gajan Pai. 3 weeks dead. Possibly. It was complicated, and it was complicated in the specific way that things become complicated when an old man does something you couldn't have predicted, and it turns out the thing he did is the thing holding the entire plan together. Gajan had been their intelligence contact, their extraction specialist, their general-purpose impossible things arranger for 4 years, and in his final act he had done something that didn't have a clean name in any language Kale spoke. He had allowed a consortium cipher lord to absorb his neural pattern, which was a thing the consortium did to enemy combatants who had information they wanted, a wholesale reading of the mind that destroyed the original in the process. Except Gajan had done it willingly. Had walked toward the cipher lord with his hands open and his eyes calm, and that particular half-smile he wore when he thought he was being especially clever, the same smile he'd worn when he'd talked Kale into 3 or 4 previous situations that had been technically suicidal and had somehow worked. The cipher lord had taken him in. Kale had watched it happen from a distance through a rangefinder, watching from 200 meters away, and what he'd seen in the aftermath was the cipher lord go absolutely still for 6 seconds, 6 full seconds, in a being that constantly micro-repositioned, that was incapable of true stillness, and then do something cipher lords were apparently not known to do. It had screamed. Kale had heard it from 200 meters, through hardened walls, which meant the sound had been enormous. And then the cipher lord had gone offline, and the consortium had scrambled to deal with whatever had happened to it, and Kale and his people had run, and Gajan hadn't run with them. But here was the thing. Gajan had told them before that if he could get inside the collective's signal architecture, if he could ride the absorption in the right direction, let it pull him in while he pushed back in a specific way, there was a chance he could find the frequency that powered the Crown network. Not shut it down himself. He couldn't do that from inside, but he could make it findable. He could mark it the way you mark a target. He could turn the unknown into something the Shard could reach, if someone could get the Shard to the hub. Which was, in theory, what they were doing. Kale pressed the heel of his hand against his eye socket and breathed through his nose until the pressure equalized. "Go sleep," Kea said. "I'm fine." "You're not fine. You're doing the thing where you sit in the engine bay and pretend to think when you're actually just sitting with something you can't fix yet. That's thinking. That's suffering while thinking," she said. "They're different. The first one is useful. The second one is just expensive." She picked the detonator back up. "I'll watch the boards until Dren's rotation. Go sleep. Whatever you're going to do about Lena, you'll do it better with 6 hours behind you." He almost said there was nothing to do about Lena. He almost said the thing that sat in his chest like a stone, which was that the woman in the forward cabin wasn't entirely Lena anymore, and hadn't been since Admiral Borland Hess had put a crown on her for 48 hours on Relay Station 9, and the crown had rewritten something in her that hadn't come fully unwritten when they'd removed the device. He almost said that he'd seen her twice now access the box's long-range transmitter after lights down, and he hadn't intercepted the signal both times, and he didn't know what she was sending or to whom, and the not knowing was eating him in a way that was actually worse than any answer would have been, because an answer was a problem, and a problem was something you could work on. He didn't say any of it. He went to the bunk room and lay down, and stared at the underside of the upper bunk for approximately 40 minutes before he actually slept. When he slept, he dreamed about a field on a planet called Karis where he and Lena had been children together. Not literally. They'd never met until the war, had grown up in different systems, had arrived at the same recruitment depot on the same gray morning, and immediately disagreed about which line to stand in. But in the dream it was a field on Karis, and they were young, younger than they'd ever actually been together. And the sky was the particular soft orange of a sun going down slow. And she was laughing at something he'd said, and the laugh was right. He woke up to Dren slamming the hatch open with the particular urgency that meant actual problem, not theoretical problem. "We have a situation," Dren said, and his voice had the texture of gravel being poured onto sheet metal. Two situations, running in parallel and converging. Kale was up and moving before Dren finished the sentence. The body had its own systems for situations like this, older and faster than the thinking parts. Talk while we move. Borland Hess's airships, 3 of them, picked up the box's thermal signature 14 minutes ago. They've been running south to cut off the approaches to the threshold. That's situation 1, and it's bad. Dren was pulling up the tactical display as they moved through the corridor, his fingers on the panel in the awkward but practiced way he'd developed for the alien interface. Situation 2 is the Reavers. Kale stopped walking for one step, then resumed. The Reavers are on this continent. The Reavers are, apparently, everywhere now. They want the shard, for a different reason than Hess wants it. Dren's jaw was tight in the particular way it got when he was managing information he didn't want to deliver out loud. Best Intelligence says they want to trade it to the Cypher Lord network in exchange for territorial rights in the southern sectors, including Proxima Shelf and the Karis Belt. That doesn't make sense. The Cypher Lords don't. I know the deal is bad. Tell that to Hammerhead. Kale stopped entirely. Hammerhead is running the Reavers. Since 6 days ago, he took over from Breck when Breck experienced a rapid and forceful rearrangement of his physical structure. Dren paused for exactly 1 beat. The force in question was Kea. They came into the forward cabin, and Kale stopped again, this time for a different reason. Lena was already at the tactical display. She had the airship trajectories mapped and color-coded, and she was running intercept calculations with the same focused, unhurried competence she'd always had, the kind that made you understand why the Resistance had put her in signals command before the war had even properly started, why people twice her rank had deferred to her read on a situation. She looked up when Kale came in, and for a moment, just a clean, clear second, she was entirely herself, entirely Lena. Reading his face the way she'd always read his face, understanding something before he'd said it. "Borland Hess wants her shard back," Lena said. "How did you know it was Hess?" "Beacon pattern. Her airships run a specific stagger formation when they're hunting ground targets. She designed the approach herself, and I briefed against it 3 years ago when we were trying to understand her tactical preferences. I know the pattern the way I know her voice." She pulled up a secondary display. "If we turn east, we can use the ridgeline to mask the box's thermal signature for approximately 40 minutes. It won't be enough to lose them entirely, but it buys time for other options." "Options like what?" "Options like me explaining something." She turned to face him fully. She did it slowly, deliberate, like she was moving through something heavier than air. "Kale, I know what you think is happening with me." The cabin was quiet, except for the engine sound in the floor and the walls. Dren was very carefully not looking at either of them. "What do I think?" Kale said. "You think the Crown is still running partially. You think when I access the long-range transmitter at night I'm broadcasting to Veth Heron. You think I'm drifting toward the collective's frequency, and you've been watching me for signs of it, and you've found some, and you've been trying to decide what to do about what you found." The last words came out careful, chosen one at a time. "You're half right." "Which half?" "The Crown is still partly active in my neural architecture. That much is accurate. What you've been watching is real. But what you've been hearing through the transmitter isn't me communicating with Veth Haron." She held his gaze. She had always been able to hold his gaze longer than he could hold hers. It was one of the first things he'd noticed about her, that total unwillingness to be the first to look away, not as aggression but as a kind of honesty, a refusal to break contact when contact mattered. "I'm broadcasting garbage, meaningless signal on Veth Haron's frequency. White noise, false positives, phantom readings. It's not spectacular. It doesn't hurt them much. But it makes her people spend processing power on filtering that they'd otherwise spend on finding us. And right now, every hour we buy matters." Silence. Dren breathed carefully through his nose. "You could have told me," Kale said. "If I'd told you, you would have stopped it. You would have decided the active crown circuitry was the primary risk and you would have made the safe call." Her voice had no accusation in it. It was almost gentle. "You make safe calls when you're scared for someone. I've watched you do it for 4 years. It's not a flaw, it's actually correct most of the time, but it would have been wrong this time." He didn't know what to say. He stood with it for a moment, the thing it cost her to say it, and the thing it cost him to hear it, and the photograph in his chest pocket, and then he said, "Turn east. Use the ridgeline. We figure out the rest while we're moving." They turned east. The ridgeline was a scar in the planet's geology. 400 kilometers of exposed basalt thrusting up from the open plain like a broken jaw, black and angular, and old in the way that makes you feel the age of the planet underneath you rather than just knowing it as a fact. The box moved through its shadow, and the airships lost them for 11 minutes and 20 seconds before the thermals shifted, and the signature leaked and they were found again. 11 minutes. In different circumstances, 11 minutes was a war. Here it was barely breathing room. "They're going to cut us off at the fold," Kea said, studying the display. She'd come forward from the engine bay without being called, which meant she'd been listening to the passive sensors in the back the whole time. This was the thing about Kea. She was always knowing more than she'd said, always a step ahead of the moment. If Hess positions her third airship at the northern approach to the fold, we have no ground route to the threshold. The canyon walls on either side are too steep for the box to climb. "We could push through under fire," Dren said. "Against 3 airships with energy weapons, in a vehicle we don't fully understand yet, with a gun crew of 1 because Sergeant Dren is also the one driving." Kea looked at him. "We could. The probability of arriving is, I think, quite low." "I've done low probability." "You've done it and survived. Not the same as it being a good strategy." "Nothing is guaranteed." "There is one thing," Kea said. She turned to Kale. "We need to get off the box before the fold. If we get off the box, we lose our cover, our speed, and the weapons systems we've spent a week learning to run." "Kale," she said it quietly, the way she said things she needed him to actually hear rather than just process. "If we stay on the box, Hess boxes us at the fold and we have a direct engagement with 3 airships and we lose. I don't want to lose today." She said it simply. "I don't want to lose today," not because of glory or strategy or mission importance, but because she'd already lost enough things in her life and wasn't interested in losing more. He heard all of that in the 4 words. He looked at the display. He looked at the fold, a narrow canyon cut through the ridgeline by an ancient waterway long since diverted, the only approach to the threshold that a ground vehicle could navigate. He looked at the airship vectors, converging from the south and west. He looked at Dren, who was running calculations with the expression of a man whose math kept coming out wrong. "What if the box goes through the fold," Kale said, "without us?" Everyone looked at him. "The box runs on autopilot," he said. "We've been building the nav interface for 5 days. Lena can set a track. The airships intercept it, engage it, realize it's empty. That buys us time on the high ground." Dren said, "The high ground is vertical. 340 meters of basalt. I know what it is. With Reaver parties on the ridge above. About the Reavers, Kale said and looked at Kaya. Something shifted in Kaya's face. Not quite the smile. The real smile was coming back slowly, like a sound returning to a room that had been silent for a long time, but the shape where the smile lived, engaged and considering. Hammerhead's people don't know he made a deal with the Cipher Lords, she said slowly. The deal was brokered directly between him and the Cipher Lord Network's territorial administrators. The crews operating on the ground don't know. They think they're independent operators working a claim against the consortium, not contractors selling their coordinates to it. She paused. If they knew their commander had sold them out, sold their positions to the very force they came here to raid against, they wouldn't honor any order he'd given, including acquiring the shard. Can you reach them? Kale said. I know their comms frequencies. I ran with Outer System Reaver crews for 3 years before the war. I know the cant, I know the channel protocols, I know what makes those people trust or not trust a transmission. She looked at her hands, at the detonator, at something that wasn't quite either of them. Give me 20 minutes with their comms officer and a clean signal line and I can flip them. Kale looked at Lena. Lena was already at the box's autopilot systems, the alien architecture she'd spent 4 evenings reverse engineering through translation software and intuition. I can set a track through the fold, speed it up to make it look occupied. The thermal signature and the gun systems on standby will look right on their sensors until they're close enough to scan the interior. She didn't look up while she spoke. 6 minutes, maybe 7. If we move fast, Kale said, 7 minutes is enough. He went aft to get the climbing gear, and when he was alone in the equipment bay for 30 seconds, he took the photograph out of his chest pocket. Him and Lena on the observation deck of Relay Station 9, before everything, her head tilted back laughing at the camera, his arm around her shoulders, both of them squinting in the recycled light. He looked at it for the full 30 seconds, and then he put it back where it lived and went to get the carabiners. The cliff face was 342 meters of cold black basalt. The shadow of the ridgeline made it colder still, the kind of cold that got into your hands and made your fingers slow and stupid if you let it. Kale led. Kaya climbed beside him, one hand on the rock and one hand pressed to her ear where she'd run a comm wire from the signal relay in her jacket pocket. He could hear her talking as they climbed low and fast, in the Outer System Reaver cant, which was a dialect built from ship names and old insults, and a particular cadence that came from years of living without planetary infrastructure, without gravity you could count on, without the assumption that the surface underneath you was going to be there tomorrow. She sounded entirely at home in it. She sounded like someone who had carried multiple lives and still had access to all of them. He listened to her talk and he climbed. Above them somewhere, already 30 meters ahead, Dren moved like he was angry at the cliff. He solved the vertical problem through a combination of technical skill and what Kale could only describe as personal aggression, the same way Dren solved most problems. Below them, through the canyon acoustics that the fold's shape created, they heard the first exchange of fire. The box had reached the canyon. Hess's airships opened on it, and the sound of energy weapons against metal hull was a long, continuous tearing sound that traveled upward through the rock itself, so that Kale felt it in his palms and his knees as well as his ears. The canyon walls lit orange in the reflected discharge, massive pulses of light that strobed and faded and strobed again. He climbed into it, the light and the sound, and he didn't look down. Kaya talked while she climbed. Her voice stayed level even when her breathing couldn't. The firing stopped. In the sudden silence, the canyon echoed with its own absence of sound, a particular acoustic that happens after very loud things. 6 minutes and some seconds. Lena's timing had been right. In the silence after the box, they heard something else, shouting on the ridge above them. Not at them, not directed down the cliff face, but among the Reaver crews up there, an argument that escalated fast through 2 languages and at least one dialect Kale couldn't identify. The kind of argument that starts as an argument and becomes something larger and less controllable as the facts that are feeding it sink in. Kaya had found the thread. She'd pulled it, and it was unraveling in real time, 150 meters above their heads. "What did you tell them?" Kale said between handholds. "The truth." Her voice was flat and clear. Hammer had sold their position coordinates to the consortium 2 weeks ago in exchange for territorial rights he had no authority to grant, which means right now Admiral Borlund Hess's third airship has their exact location, which means in approximately 12 minutes it will make a weapons pass over the ridge. "Do you know that for certain, or?" I made a reasonable inference based on Hess's known patrol patterns and presented it as certain intelligence from a source I described as being inside Hammerhead's own command structure. She pulled herself up over a ledge and extended a hand to help him follow. "Was that wrong?" He thought about it for 1 second. "No." They came over the ridgeline into cold wind and the last of the night, and the Reaver parties that had been on the high ground were in motion, not toward them, toward each other, toward the argument that Kaya had started, and that had now become a redistribution of allegiances at high speed. 2 crews separating from the larger group, moving away from Hammerhead's direct command toward a different configuration. Dren was sitting on a flat rock 30 meters from the ridge edge, rifle across his knees, eating something from a ration pack with the expression of a man who had arrived early and had been waiting slightly too long. "The box is gone," Kale said. Hess blew it apart. "She seems displeased." Dren took another bite. "Her third airship changed vector about 4 minutes ago. I believe your intervention found an audience." "They're good communicators when properly motivated," Kaya said. They moved north through a dry streambed and then up along a game trail that had probably predated the war by several thousand years and would probably outlast it. The threshold was 6 kilometers, 6 kilometers of open highland that had no cover and no concealment and was traversed entirely on foot, and the 3 consortium airships were visible as lights in the southern dark, 2 still at the fold, 1 now moving northeast toward the Reaver position on the ridge. The window was there. It was narrow. It would close, but it was there. "I need to say something," Lena said. She'd been walking beside him since they came down from the ridge, and she'd been quiet in her particular way, which was not the silence of someone who had nothing to say, but the silence of someone who is choosing very carefully what to say and how. He knew that silence the way he knew most things about her, by having paid attention over a long time. "Say it," he said. They walked. He watched the ground ahead and the sky and the lights of the airships. "I can feel the Crown's signal," she said. "Even now, even with everything I'm doing to suppress it. You know how you can hear a tone at the edge of your hearing, not quite sound, but you're certain it's there, a kind of pressure rather than a pitch." She paused. "It's like that. Constant. It's always there, at some level of attention or another. Okay. Sometimes it's stronger than other times. Sometimes I can feel what it's trying to push me to do, what shape of action it's optimizing toward. And when I'm choosing not to do that thing, when I'm deciding against it, I'm not always certain whether I'm choosing or whether the signal just hasn't been strong enough to override the choice yet." He stopped walking. She stopped beside him. Dren and Kaya continued ahead and left them in a pocket of private dark. "What are you telling me?" Kale said. "I'm telling you that when the shard does what it does at the threshold, when the Crown network shuts down, I don't know what that means for a Crown that's still partially running inside someone. Whether it's a clean shutdown or whether it's something else." She said it without flinching, without drama, with the same steady directness she'd used in the forward cabin. "I don't know what I come out as on the other side of it. I wanted you to know that before we get there. You come out as Lena. You don't know that. I know you've been running interference signals for us while simultaneously managing the box's autopilot and talking me out of at least 4 decisions that would have been wrong." He turned to look at her. I know you told me the truth about the transmitter when you had every practical reason to keep it to yourself. I know that you've been the clearest thinking person in this crawler every day for 6 days, including the days when the crown signal was presumably at its strongest. He let that sit for a moment. Whatever the crown is doing to you, it's losing. She looked at him in the dark. He could see her face well enough, the Highland wind pulling at her hair, the distant reflected light of airships on her cheekbones. You've always been more confident in me than the evidence supports, she said. You've always been more confident in me than the evidence supports, he said back. We balance out. She made a sound, not quite a laugh, not quite a breath, something between them, the specific sound a laugh makes when it's working against gravity. Then she started walking and he walked beside her, and for a moment it was the photograph, it was the observation deck, it was the recycled light. They were a kilometer from the threshold when the Reavers found them. Not Hammerhead's main body, those crews were occupied with the consortium's third airship, and with the internal reckoning that Kea had started, which by now had almost certainly passed the point of no return. These were the splinter element, the forward party that had been holding position between the Reaver main body and the threshold, in case the target came through on foot. 3 of them. Moving fast and professionally, coming out of a drainage cut in the high ground with the approach geometry of people who had actually been trained, and not just self-selected for aggression. The lead Reaver was a woman, broad through the shoulders, her face marked with the scarification pattern of the outer system mining guilds, the kind of marks you earn through years of work in conditions that leave evidence. She carried a Disruption Lance consortium manufacture, which meant either taken or purchased, and either way said something about how well-resourced Hammerhead's operation had been before tonight. She leveled it at Kale. The shard, she said, that's what we're here for. Give us that, and you go wherever you want. You're here for territorial rights in the southern sectors, Kale said, which is what Hammerhead promised you, which Hammerhead traded away to the Cypher Lord network 2 weeks ago, along with your current positions. The lance didn't move. Prove it. Kea stepped forward. She spoke quietly to the lead Reaver in the outer system camp, and she was specific, not vague, not rhetorical, but specific in the way of someone recounting operational detail that can only come from direct experience. Names, dates, the structure of Hammerhead's meetings with the Cypher Lord territorial administrators, the delivery mechanism for the coordinates, the confirmation protocol the consortium had used when they'd received the intelligence. It was more than she should have known from a public information source, and the lead Reaver knew that immediately. The lance came down. The lead Reaver's expression went through something that wasn't quite anger because anger is too simple. It was the expression of someone recalculating everything they've committed themselves to in the past month and arriving at a number they don't like. He sold us, she said. It came out flat like a diagnosis. He sold you to the exact people you came here to work against, Kea said. You weren't raid crews. You were bait. The 3 Reavers looked at each other. Then the lead one looked at the sky in the direction of the lights, calculating. The shard, she said to Kale. It shuts the crowns down. That's the plan. Hess has 2 of my people in crown chains. She's had them for 7 months. Her jaw was set. Her hands were controlled in the way that hands are controlled when something has to be controlled or something will happen that can't be undone. If the crowns go dark, they walk out of wherever they are, Kale said, same as everyone who's been wearing one. He watched her do the calculation, watched her weigh it against what Hammerhead had promised and what Hammerhead had delivered and what it meant to be sold. Go, she said. She stepped aside. If it doesn't work and you're still alive, we'll have a conversation. That's fair, Kale said, and he meant it. The threshold was a structure, and it was not a structure. From the outside it was geology, a formation of enormous standing stones in dark basalt, arranged in a pattern that could have been natural if you didn't study the angles, and the angles were wrong in a very precise way, too consistent, too intentional, the work of something that understood geometry at a level that pre-existed human or consortium arrival on this planet. Inside the formation, the air was different, older. It tasted like a room that has been sealed for a very long time, and whose door you have just opened for the first time in many years. There was a cipher lord in the center of it. Kale's hand moved toward his weapon, and he made himself stop. Cipher lords didn't stand still, they displaced, a constant micro-repositioning that was indistinguishable from stillness unless you knew what you were looking at. But this one had something else in it, something wrong in the specific way that things are wrong when they've been changed from the inside. It was large, old. Its chitinous membrane surface rippled with the processing of constant incoming signal. It turned its attention toward them, and its attention was the specific attention of something that has been waiting. Then it said, in a voice that was wrong in every acoustic dimension but was recognizably a voice, structured, intentional, aimed at human hearing, with the effort of something adapting to a medium that wasn't its own, it said. "You took your time." Dren said something under his breath, in a language Kale couldn't identify. Kea made a sound. Kale said, "Gajan." The Cipher Lord's membrane rippled in a pattern that was not a smile and was not nothing. "I have been in here for 3 weeks. I have developed opinions about the Cipher Lord's sensory experience that I will share at considerable length when we are somewhere that isn't here." A pause. "Also, I found the frequency. I have been waiting, somewhat impatiently, for someone to bring the shard so that I could provide it." Lena said very quietly, "Is he?" "The absorption was thorough," Gajan said, and his voice carried something that was not quite grief and not quite peace but lived in the territory between them, in the place where people go when they've made the kind of choice you only make once. "What I am now is difficult to describe in terms that translate cleanly. Better than not being is perhaps the most accurate summation. The Cipher Lord's architecture is interesting. I have had considerable time to understand it from inside, and I have arranged several things accordingly." "The frequency," Kale said. 7.441 on the collective's tertiary signal band. The Crown network runs on a carrier that is embedded in the collective's tertiary infrastructure. It's not the primary band, which is why 3 years of attempts to jam it have failed. Everyone was looking at the wrong frequency. The shard generates a destructive interference pattern at 7.441 natively. You need to be within contact range of a network hub to initiate the cascade. Once initiated, the shutdown propagates through every connected node simultaneously. A pause. The membrane rippled again. "The hub is behind you." They turned. It was in the stones. A device about the size of a fuel drum, flush with the basalt of one of the standing stones, consortium manufacture with the particular aesthetic of something that is meant to be overlooked. It had a port, an interface point. Sized for the shard. They'd walked past it on the way in. 30 seconds of contact, Gajan said. The interference builds, the cascade initiates, and then every crown anywhere on this network goes dark. He paused. I should note, I may have added certain additional parameters to the cascade during the 3 weeks I have had to work on this inside the collective's own architecture. The crowns are not the only consortium technology running on the tertiary band. What else runs on it? Kale said. Gajan's voice had the particular texture of a man who is being precise while also being extremely satisfied with himself. A number of things. Ship propulsion management systems, for one. Kale looked at Lena. She was already looking at the hub. Her face was completely still. Impossible to read, even for him, even now. She had the shard in her hands. She'd taken it from the carry case sometime in the last 30 seconds without him noticing, which meant she'd been thinking about this since the last kilometer at least, maybe longer. Lena, he said. I heard him, very quiet. You don't have to be the one to. Yes, I do. She said it without drama, without self-sacrifice performance. Just a statement of what was true. She was the one who could read the hub's interface because she'd spent 5 days reverse engineering consortium architecture. She was the one whose hands already knew what they were doing. She was the one for whom this moment was also something personal, something that went beyond the mission. It has to be 30 seconds of contact. Approximately, Gajan said. Okay, she breathed in slow through her nose. He watched her face. He watched her make the decision the way people make real decisions, not the dramatic version but the actual one, which is small and quiet and happens in a moment of stillness in the middle of everything. Okay. She stepped to the hub. She pressed the shard into the port. The sound that came was below hearing. Cale felt it first in his chest, a pressure that wasn't sound but was made of the same material, and then in his jaw, his hands, the soles of his boots. The standing stones picked it up and amplified it, conducting the interference pattern through 400 meters of ancient basalt, building and building and building. The hub went from inert to active, a light that built from nothing to something too bright to look at directly, and then to a color Cale had no name for, and then dark. The kind of dark that is not off but finished. Lena's hand came away from the hub. She stood very still. The sound was gone. Everything was very quiet. Lena, Cale said. She turned around. Her face was different, not transformed, not dramatically changed in any way that would read from a distance, but changed in the way that rooms change when a window you didn't know was curtain gets opened. Something present that had been muffled, something there that had been suppressed. Her eyes found his and they were clear in a way that made him understand, with a retroactive clarity that hit him all at once and all at the same time, how not quite clear they had been. He hadn't known how clouded they were until they weren't. It's quiet, she said. What is? The frequency. She pressed her fingers against her temple where the crown's mark still lived. There's nothing there. It's just quiet, like a sound I'd been hearing for so long I forgot it was a sound. Outside the standing stones, through the basalt and the highland wind, the pitch of an airship engine changed. Then it stopped. Dren said that's. The airships run on consortium power architecture, Kaya said. She sounded stunned in the way you are stunned when something actually works on the scale you'd hoped but hadn't expected. If the tertiary band. It's not just crowns, Gajan said, in the voice that was wrong but recognizable. I may have been thorough. The consortium will be very displeased. I find that I have some difficulty being displeased about that. Dren sat down on the ground, not strategically, not tactically. He just sat right there on the stones inside the threshold and put his face in his hands and made a sound that Cale had never heard from him before. Not crying, Dren didn't cry in any way that Cale had ever witnessed, but something in the same neighborhood, the sound a person makes when a weight has been on them so long that its removal is almost physically wrong, when the muscles that were holding it up suddenly have nothing to push against. Cale stood next to Lena. She stood next to him. For a moment nobody said anything. The first airship going down was audible through the stone, a long, descending sound that started high and got lower and became a percussion that rolled across the highland. Then the echo came back off the ridgeline. Then silence. Hammerhead is going to be furious, Kaya said. Hammerhead can be furious somewhere that isn't here, Dren said, from the ground. We still have to move, Cale said. Consortium ground forces don't run on the tertiary band, and whatever Hess's crews on foot are going to do when they lose the airships, they're going to do it toward us. Cale, Lena said. He stopped. She was looking at him the way she'd looked at him in the forward cabin when she told him about the transmitter. Except this was that look without the weight behind it, without the thing she'd been managing that he hadn't been allowed to see. We've always figured out how to get out, she said. We will figure it out this time. He looked at her face. He looked at it the way he'd looked at the photograph, cataloging it, holding it, understanding it as a thing he was lucky to have access to. Not because he was about to lose it. Because he'd come close enough to losing it that having it back, having it clear, was a thing that deserved to be acknowledged. "There are Reaver crews on the high ground," Kea said. She was turning the detonator over in her fingers, not building anything, just moving her hands the way she moved her hands when she was thinking, and when she was calm. "Who are very angry with their former commander, and a cipher lord containing an old man with 3 weeks of opinions and, apparently, a thorough grasp of consortium signal architecture." She looked at the displaced shape of Gajan, at whatever it was that had gone into the cipher lord and was still, in some important sense, Gajan. "I think we have more resources than we had an hour ago." "Gajan," Kale said. "Still here," Gajan said. "Is there anything else running on the tertiary band that we should know about?" A pause. The membrane rippled in a way that Kale was beginning to read as amusement. "Several things. I will need some time to explain them all. Perhaps while we walk, if this body is ambulatory, which I believe it is, though I confess the coordination requires more concentration than I would prefer." "Can you walk?" Dren said from the ground. "I can displace," Gajan said, in a tone that implied this was self-evidently better. "I may be slow." "We'll wait for you," Kale said. He took the photograph out of his chest pocket. He looked at it one more time, the observation deck, the recycled light, the soft orange of the laugh, and he put it back. Then he checked his weapon, checked the charge on the detonator Kea handed him without being asked, and looked at his crew. Dren was on his feet. The cipher lord that was Gajan had begun to move, displacing northward in the specific micro-repositioning that was faster than it looked. Kea was already checking the path ahead, her shoulders level, her hands easy. Lena had her eyes on the horizon where the second airship was beginning its own long descent, trailing light. "How do we want to do this?" Dren said. "Fast," Kale said, "and together." "And loud," Kea said. "As loud as we want," Lena said. They went out of the standing stones into the highland wind, all of them together, into the cold and the open and the long, complicated, not yet finished work of making sure that what had happened in that circle of stones meant something. The consortium would regroup. The network would try to rebuild. Hammerhead would answer for what he'd done, or he wouldn't, because consequences didn't arrive on schedule. There were more fights coming. There were always more fights coming. But the crowns were dark, the frequency was quiet, the airships were falling. Somewhere inside a cipher lord that was no longer entirely a cipher lord, a half-smile persisted. And behind them in the standing stones, the hub that had run the Crown network for 3 years sat completely, permanently, finished. Above the threshold, the last airship fell. It fell slowly and then all at once, the way things fall when they've been held up by something that no longer holds. It hit the highland 3 kilometers north, and the light it made was orange and enormous against the dark, and the sound arrived 4 seconds after, and none of them looked away. They had earned the right to watch it fall. That was the thing about humans that the consortium had not properly modeled, had not adequately prepared for, had failed to account for in all its calculations and tactical assessments and crown chain projections. Humans didn't stop. Not for lack of resources, not for lack of precedent, not because the odds were wrong or the math didn't work, or the enemy was larger or older or built from better material. You could take their weapons and they'd find new ones. You could overwrite their people and the overwriting would be turned into a weapon by the people it hadn't quite finished overwriting. You could march them into the cold and dark and the vertical and the impossible, and they would climb. They would always climb. The highland was dark and cold, and the consortium's ground forces were somewhere to the south, and the Reaver crews were on the high ground, and the road out was going to be long and disputed, and not clean. Kale walked into it. They all walked into it. Together. 3 days before the fold, before the climb, before the threshold, before any of it, Kale had sat alone in the box's mess area at 300 and tried to write a letter. Not a military communication, not a report. An actual letter, the kind that nobody wrote anymore because the war had made the question of who would receive any given letter deeply uncertain. He'd started it 4 times. The first version was tactical. Here is what I know, here is what I plan, here is who has which information if I don't come back. He'd thrown that one away. The second version was emotional, and he'd thrown that one away faster. The third version was neither, and therefore was nothing. Just sentences that sat on the page and pointed in no particular direction. The fourth version he'd started, and then stopped mid-sentence and sat with the pen in his hand, and tried to understand what he was actually trying to say. What he was trying to say was this: I'm not sure I've been paying attention in the right ways. He'd been paying attention to tactics, to threat assessment, to probability calculations and approach vectors, and the question of whether the box's gun ports could be safely operated by a crew of 1 in an emergency. He'd been paying attention to Lena's symptoms, to the Crown's effects, to the question of when a risk becomes a liability becomes an unbearable choice. He'd been paying attention to everything except the thing that was actually happening, which was that the person he'd known for 4 years and trusted with his actual life, repeatedly, in conditions that tested what trust meant, had continued to be exactly that person even while something was trying very hard to make her into someone else. He'd put the pen down and gone to watch her sleep for a moment through the open bunkroom door. She was on her side, one arm folded under her head, the way she always slept. The Crown's scar tissue at her temple was visible. Her breathing was even. The box's engines ran under everything. He'd stood there for about 30 seconds, which was long enough to feel the truth of what he was looking at, and short enough that he didn't have to decide what to do about it yet. Then he'd gone back to his bunk and not slept for another 2 hours, and thought about the field on Karis that wasn't a real memory, and about the orange sky, and about how the dream kept the laugh right even when the waking world complicated everything else. 6 days before that, the box had been Admiral Borland Hess's. Hess ran the consortium's northern territorial operations from a mobile command post on the Kessler Flats, a fortified position built around the box and 2 other heavy crawlers, supported by 3 airships and a ground complement of approximately 400. She was, by any reasonable military assessment, not the kind of target that a team of 4 with borrowed weapons and incomplete intelligence should attempt to raid. Kale knew this. Dren had said it in exactly those words. Kea had said it differently, which was that there were better ways to achieve the same outcome. Lena had been quiet. What Lena had eventually said was, "The box has the long-range transmitter we need to signal Gajan. Without Gajan's guidance, the shard is just an artifact we can't use. Without the shard working correctly, we go to the threshold and nothing happens and we've wasted everything." She'd paused. "So if we need the transmitter and the transmitter is in the box, then I suppose we need the box." This was the logic of people who had run out of options and had decided to stop treating that as a constraint. The raid had taken 40 minutes and should not have worked. Kale still wasn't entirely sure why it had worked. The proximate cause was that Hess's Crown chains were running a scheduled update cycle at 200, which meant that approximately a third of her personal complement were in partial cognitive suspension for maintenance during the exact 40 minutes the raid was happening. Kea had known about the update cycle because Kea had once worn a crown, and she knew what the update cycle felt like from the inside, and she'd been able to predict its timing based on the behavior she'd observed in Hess's people over 2 days of surveillance. The further cause was Dren, who had an approach to obstacles that Kale could only describe as personal. And the further cause still was Lena, who had walked into Hess's command bay alone, unarmed, or apparently unarmed, which was not the same thing as unarmed if you knew what to look for, and had sat down at Hess's communications interface and started working it. The Crown's partial activity in her had let her interface with the consortium system in a way that would have taken any of the rest of them hours, or a direct bypass that would have triggered every alarm in the post. She'd moved through the system like someone who spoke the language natively, which in a way she did now, in a way that was the residue of something terrible, and was also, like most residues of terrible things, not only terrible. She'd gotten them Gajan's location. She'd gotten them the tertiary band frequency, partially, enough for Gajan to complete when they reached the threshold. She'd gotten them the box's ignition codes. Then she'd walked out and they'd driven away in the box, while Hess's people were still figuring out what had happened. And Hess had been, by all accounts, extremely displeased. Cale had not known at that point whether to feel relieved or terrified. He'd settled on both. They'd been driving for 6 days. They'd made camp in the box each night, rotating watches, eating alien rations that were nutritionally adequate and texturally baffling. They'd repaired 2 systems that Dren had improvised badly the first time. They'd argued about the route twice and been wrong both times and found a third route that worked. They'd had 2 engagements with consortium ground patrols that were brief and decided quickly in their favor, partly because the box looked like consortium equipment from a distance. And by the time the patrols got close enough to realize the occupants were wrong, they were in a position where that realization was no longer useful. It had been, as the operational phase of impossible plans went, going better than expected. Which was why Cale had been watching for what was going wrong. What was going wrong was what was going wrong with Lena. He knew it. He'd known it since the second night when he'd watched her at the transmitter. He'd known what he was looking at, and he'd made himself not say what he knew, because saying it would have forced a decision that he wasn't ready to make, which was the decision about whether the partial crown activity was a tactical risk that outweighed the operational value of having Lena fully in the field. He hadn't been ready to make that call. He hadn't made it. And it had turned out he was beginning to understand this in a way that went deeper than the intellectual understanding he'd had in the forward cabin. It had turned out that not making it was the right decision, not because he'd been lucky, not because the situation had resolved itself, but because he'd been wrong about what was happening, and the only way to discover that he was wrong was to not foreclose the situation before he had to. This was the thing about trust that was hard to explain to people who hadn't needed it in the specific way that war required. Trust wasn't the absence of doubt. Trust was the decision to remain open past the point where doubt became comfortable. Doubt was easy. Doubt felt like intelligence. But doubt, held too long and too tightly, became its own kind of blindness. He'd stayed open. She'd told him the truth, and the truth had been different from what he'd feared. That was the thing he hadn't been paying attention to in the right ways, not the fear which was obvious, not the doubt which was reasonable, but the pattern underneath both, the pattern of what Lena actually did versus what the fear said she might do, the accumulated evidence of 4 years of decisions she'd made and how she'd made them. The evidence had said she was still herself. He just had to be willing to read it. After the threshold, after the airships fell and the frequency went quiet, and they came out of the standing stones into the highland wind, they walked northeast along a ridge trail that the box's maps had described as a secondary approach, but that turned out to be faster than the primary route, because the primary route was blocked by what remained of the first airship. The light from its burning was visible for 2 hours. The lead reaver, the woman with the mining guild marks and the disruption lance she'd lowered and not raised again, found them at the 3rd kilometer. She came up from the south with her 2 people, and she walked beside them for a while without talking, and then she said, "The 2 people Hess was running in crown chains. How do I find them?" Hess had a processing facility at the Kessler Flats, Lena said. She was talking in the way she always talked about consortium intelligence, which was with a certainty that came from having been briefly, partly, against her will, adjacent to that information architecture. She ran her crown subjects through it in rotation. If they were functional, they'd have been on the active roster working. She'd have pulled them back to base when the engagement started. So they're at the flats. If they're still functional, yes. If Hess lost power to her base systems when the tertiary band went down, she paused. The crown chains run on a separate local power source. They'd still be active at the device level even after the network shut down. But the behavioral programming would have lost its update cycle. They'd be confused, probably, aware something had changed, but not yet entirely clear on who they were. The lead reaver was quiet for a moment. How long until they're clear? Hours, maybe a day, depends on how long they'd been chained and how intact they were going in. Lena looked at her. You should find them soon. Familiarity helps. Someone they knew before. The lead reaver nodded, then she looked at Kale. I'm going south. I know. If this holds, if the network stays down. It'll hold, Gajan said. He had been displacing steadily beside them, adapting to the pace with the particular concentration he described, the coordination of a Cypher Lord's body being operated by a consciousness that had not grown up in it. I was quite thorough. If it holds, the Reaver said to Kale, you and I are going to have a different kind of conversation about what comes next. I look forward to it, Kale said. She turned south. Her two people went with her, and they moved fast, the way people move when they have somewhere they need to be. Dren watched them go. Think she'll actually talk? Her people were in chains, Kea said. When they come out of it, she'll want to do something with that. Yes, she'll talk. She paused. Whether Hammerhead talks is a different question. Hammerhead, Dren said, is going to have a difficult time talking from wherever he is right now. Where is he? Kale said. Kea looked at the distant orange light of the burning airship. I made certain suggestions when I was on comms with his crews about his current location, specific enough suggestions that I believe his people were able to act on them. She turned back to the trail. He is having a very bad night. They walked. The highland opened up ahead of them, the stars clear and cold above, the ground firm under their feet. The consortium's ground forces were still out there somewhere in the dark, regrouping, trying to understand what had happened and what came next. There were decisions being made right now in facilities far from here, decisions about how to respond to the loss of the tertiary band and the crown network and the airships and the intelligence architecture that had run through all of them. Those decisions would produce actions. The actions would require responses. This was how it went. This was how it always went. But tonight, on this ridge, with the frequency quiet and the crowns dark and the airship light on the horizon and the old man's consciousness riding a Cypher Lord's body beside them, making occasional dry observations about the sensory experience of displaced movement, tonight was a particular kind of clear. Gajan, Lena said. Still here, Gajan said. Does it hurt being where you are? A pause, the membrane rippled. It is not what I am accustomed to, but I have found that I am adapting. Another pause. This body is very well designed for the transmission and reception of signal. The range is extraordinary. I have been, since the cascade, listening to the consortium's emergency communications across a very wide area. And Kale said. And they are very upset, Gajan said, with immense satisfaction. It is quite pleasant to listen to. Kale felt something happen in his face. He hadn't felt it in a while. It took him a moment to recognize it as a smile. Lena heard it in his breathing. She always heard things in his breathing before he knew he was making them. And she turned and looked at him. And she was smiling too. And it was the right smile. The one from the field on Karis that he only knew from the dream. The one that had always been hers, and had never stopped being hers even when something had tried very hard to root it through a different architecture. We should keep moving, Dren said. We should, Kale agreed. He didn't stop smiling. They walked north through the cold and the clear highland dark, all of them together, with the burning light behind them and the whole long, complicated, uncertain road ahead, and they were alive. And that was more than enough to build from. It had always been more than enough.